Today is September 7th, 2018, and we are speaking with Dr. Corrine Sanchez from San Ildefonso Pueblo in northern New Mexico. We are joined by our videographer, Dr. Beverly Singer, and our project assistant, Jonna Payden. The interview is being conducted by Rose Diaz, IPCC project coordinator. Thanks for joining us today and welcome. Before beginning the interview, I'd like to share some of your personal and work history as background to our discussion. Dr. Sanchez is the great-great-granddaughter of the famous potter Maria Martinez and artist and former governor Julian Martinez. Both artists contributed significantly to introducing the arts of San Ildefonso to the world, and the family maintains its artistic Pueblo influence in the arts. Corrine's mother, Kathy Juan Povey, is an educator and very committed to community activism and responsibilities through her work as an environmental justice program manager. Her father, Gilbert Sanchez, now retired, comes from a long-time political family and became Pueblo governor with a passion for the issues around sovereignty and the protection of the environment. She attended local schools, including San Ildefonso Day School, then did the rest of her schooling in Pueblo. She attended Clark University in Massachusetts, attained her undergraduate and master's degree from the University of New Mexico, and in 2015 graduated from Arizona State University with a PhD in Justice Studies. In 2016, she was one of 16 leaders chosen in the first cohort of the Move to End Violence initiative, a program to improve the status and well-being of girls and women worldwide who often experience violence, poverty, and discrimination simply because they are female. She has traveled extensively and is a recognized speaker worldwide and has received many honors and awards related to her community work. She served on the National Tribal Child Sexual Abuse Task Force, the New Mexico Child Safe House Network, Child Sexual Abuse Prevention Board, the New Mexico Environmental Law Center, and the Native American Children's Alliance, consisting of child abuse professionals and allied partners dedicated to end the epidemic of child abuse in Indian country. This organization develops protocols for investigations of sexual abuse, sexual crimes against children, and determines the procedures for conducting forensic testing. This is a coordinated effort between the District Attorney's Office, law enforcement, mental health, and hospital workers. She is also a governor's appointee to the New Mexico Domestic Violence Leadership Committee. An activist since high school in the area of environmental justice and Native American women's rights, she followed her mother into an important nonprofit organization, Tiwa Women United. The organization represents the Tiwa-speaking pueblos of Nambe, Puake, San Ildefonso, Okeowenge, Santa Clara, and Tasuki. Originally, the organization was created to address issues of radioactive contaminants released into the environment by Los Alamos National Labs, situated just above the Pueblo. But their efforts did not stop there. Today, the organization deals with a variety of issues, including promoting healthy relationships, addressing domestic violence, sexual abuse, addiction, youth leadership, reproductive health, women's economic freedom, environmental health, and agricultural sustainability. The goals are to heal communities using Tiwa values of language, tradition, and practice. As Dr. Sanchez states, we're coming together and challenging our governments. Our children are sacred and we are sacred. Our earth is sacred and we have the power to change things. We may not have huge numbers, but we have huge hearts. Welcome. I'd like to start by talking about historical trauma. And as a Native woman, your work concerns trauma within a historical context. Can you help us to understand the repercussions of that history in New Mexico?
Wow, that's a deep question. I am grateful for being able to sit with women in circle and talk about our history as Native people. And my understanding comes from that perspective of women and how we're treated now in our communities, how things were or might have been, to this reality of how so many of us are experiencing sexual violence at the hands of strangers, as well as our family members, our community members. And having had that personal experience was really trying to understand in our communities where we talk about our core values of caring for each other, loving one another, being responsible for one another, how could we come to this place of so many having this experience of violence in their lifetime. And through scholars and people that have come through the organization, like Dr. Beverly Singer, Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, Dr. Eduardo Duran, and his partner Bonnie, and being part of American Studies at UNM, reading women writers and really trying to get a better understanding of our experiences, and reading people that actually had similar experiences and were able to talk about it and write about it. When you grow up in the silence, it's more difficult. You tend to personalize it, that is just me, that is just my community or my family. But really, when we talk about the historical context, really understanding how colonialism happened, how state violence happens to our communities, genocide and religious inquisitions that came through our communities, I began to understand, and the women in our organization began to understand through this analysis and through these conversations that it wasn't just about us. It wasn't just Native people or Native women or Native men or Native communities. In the historical context, colonialism happens where people come in and take land, and learning about the doctrine of discovery and laws and statutes and codes that foreign governments have pushed against us or put upon us, and transformed our way of being, of how we lived in our communities, how we related to each other, how we related to Mother Earth, and that impact. So being part of the Santa Fe Leadership Institute, and learning also more from Regis Pecos and Dr. Cornell Choza, about the 200 years of policy, right? There was a display here at the Pueblo Cultural Center that talked about that. And a lot of us growing up don't hear that history. We don't learn that history in our school books or in our classrooms. I don't think until college really did I get exposed to that. But I was blessed to be part of circles where this was being discussed by women in our community, by people who were talking about the impacts of high suicide rates, high substance abuse rates, high death rates, preventable deaths in our community. And we're talking about what was the underlying cause of this, right? And so learning about the historical context, learning about intergenerational trauma, or learning about individual complex trauma and our early childhood experiences, all of those in our perspective have an exponential growth of trauma in our lifetime. And so we talk as Te Women United about our trauma rock exercise, so that we go through the stories of generations of women who, like my great-great-grandmother, lived to see trains coming into our community, lived to see economic transformation happen, from agricultural base to a more money system, a more capitalistic system, who spoke, was monolingual in Tewa, and then with the coming of the Spanish, then we had our community members that were trilingual, Tewa, Spanish, English. And that we've had these generations witness this, right? So having the blessing of my great-great-grandmother and my great-grandmother and those in my community to be able to talk and share and hear. We didn't have computers, right? We didn't have cell phones, and now everybody's walking around with one. But those pieces are that historical context. Those pieces are the lived realities that our communities experienced as land was taken away, as violence occurred, rape, mutilation, taking children away. And so for us, as Te Women United, really looking at how we are experiencing that violence, our families are experiencing that violence, and being able to tie it back to these experiences of young children being taken away, not being raised by their parents, right? Not seeing that aspect, and also witnessing violence at the hands of adults, and then coming back to the community, and then having children. And what does that mean when you have children and don't have those experiences of that mentoring, of that nurturing? We're fortunate in our communities that we have our core values, that we have our languages that are still being spoken, that we have practices and traditions that have maintained, but we're also struggling and dealing with accommodation syndrome or masking, where we survived, and we've done things in our community to protect ourselves and protect that rich cultural knowledge. And at the same time that it's offered that protection, it has also offered the silencing of stories, the silencing of women's voices. Growing up, I would hear that, you know, women's role was this, men's role was this. And growing up in a women's organization, I can understand that we could have gender-based roles. I can understand that we have different responsibilities, but nowhere in our culture does it say that one is better than the other. Nowhere in our culture does it say man is here and woman is here. I've grown up with women and men in my community and in other communities that talk about a fluidity of male and female energy that flows through all of us. And so as a young woman growing up, trying to understand this historical context, trying to understand my individual experiences of violence and trauma around sexual violence, because it was directed at me as a woman, as a girl, based on my sex, and trying to make sense of all of that. I think the more we're able to share story, the more we're able to learn and know history, it helps us understand what generations experienced before us and why we may be in this situation at this point. And for us as women and people from our communities to be able to say, we didn't get here on our own, and through the connections and through the story sharing and through the history, that we are able to reclaim practices and traditions and other things, and uncover and get rid of abusive cultural practices that no longer serve us. And I feel that's been a hard struggle to come to, that realization, because we're not the only cultural community that experiences that. And as women, Native women, Indigenous women, that there have been traditional cultural practices that have harmed us. But I feel like that has been impacted by this historical context, these intergenerational experiences, and then these individual layering of other traumas. And the healing part is really about, you know, how do we understand more, be more aware of, and be able to transform the narrative from this point forward.
I found very interesting, you know, in talking to you before about the historical context and all of the work that you've done has led you to become a forensic interviewer. How do you define that work, and how do you engage in it?
I retired from forensic interviewing, to say, in 2010, as I transitioned in my role at Te Women United. But I want to say that that has been the most fulfilling role for me. As a survivor of child sexual abuse, to be able to intervene in a young person's experience and to be able to transform responses from law enforcement to medical to legal systems, to be able to listen and hear and understand that young people experience this, nonverbal children experience this violence, and it impacts them, right? So having gone through that darkness of that abuse, the confusion of not liking myself because I was a girl and hearing things that girls are allowed to do and not allowed to do. And then really recognizing that what happened to me because I was a girl. I had to reconcile a lot of those experiences, and I knew at points in my life where I thought about taking my life, where I wanted to take my life, that the women that surrounded me, that the community that surrounded me helped to get me through that experience. And the things that I was hearing as I was growing up, that our ancestors are here, that they are always with us, that we ask in prayer, that we ask for strength, that we ask for guidance. And so when I would run to the river or run anywhere, I was praying, I was asking for strength. I would go to the trees. My Indian name is Kaperipovi, and which means cottonwood tree, cotton fluff. So I would run to the river and sit with this cottonwood tree and cry. I didn't want to have my parents and others hear what I was struggling with, because a lot of kids who've experienced child sexual abuse don't necessarily tell those that they love because they don't want to hurt them. And we know that this impacts families in such tremendous ways. So as a forensic interviewer, I kind of by accident fell into that role. At Te Women United, we were developing our Voices program in 1995, 1994. And there was this opportunity. We were working with the Santa Fe Rape Crisis Center, and I was going to be starting my master's program. And I could, work and go to school and figure out the economic pieces of it. But it really, for me, was a healing journey, to be able to do this work, to be able to give voice to those that may not have had their voice at that time, to be able to role model for others, I think, who are survivors, to be like, you don't have to hide, you don't have to be ashamed, this is an experience, and we want accountability, and we want people to be held responsible. And the forensic interviewing program, in its early days, really allowed for that to happen. We were joining it at the cusp of its beginning, and now there's a whole movement around children's advocacy centers and co-location sites and multidisciplinary teams, which has come a long way, but also on that path has also become more professionalized, which I feel doesn't necessarily always benefit our community. I wasn't a professional when I started, and was able to provide that peer support, was able to learn, was able to gain knowledge and information. And I feel in our communities, we have a lot of people who can do the same. When I was in high school and going through my struggle, it was my peers that helped me. So at Te Women United and the circles that I've been able to be a part of, it's always been about the peer support, women helping women, young girls helping young girls, young boys helping young boys. And so that peer support is really, has been the key to the healing and reclamation of the work that we're doing and continue to do. And pushing back against that kind of professionalized certification kind of piece has also been a struggle that we've been trying to do and to maintain. And I think there's a balance of that we as communities are still continuing to struggle with. Mm-hmm. But the forensic interviewing piece, I feel, is like, that's the direct service that I really miss. Being able to be with young people, being able to have a young child or young person meet me for the first time and be able to share their story. That's a gift, to be able to hold someone's story of their experiences, and to at the same time hold that for them personally, but also having the responsibility to advocate for system change, for systemic changes, so that women can come forward, young people can come forward and share. And right now we're in that cusp of the Me Too movement, right? Because we know this has always happened because of the history of genocide, because of the history of colonialism, devaluing and dehumanizing other peoples has been the practice in this country. And so how do we move from that? But I'm grateful for the law enforcement officers, I'm grateful for the legal professionals, I'm grateful for the medical professionals who do this work, who continue to do this work. I know it was challenging for them as well, because you see someone hurting, you see a young person hurting, and they worked diligently to change that. And I know as we're also in this time frame of police violence, that's also something that I've struggled with. Wanting to hold an institution accountable, also knowing that there are individuals within that institution who have hearts just like everybody else, and who have stood in courtrooms, who have stood in places to protect those that have been harmed. And how do we reconcile that, and how do we do that? We do definitely need to hold institutions accountable that continue to promote and do that state harm and state violence. And at the same time also recognize that there are individuals in there who are part of the process, and how do we do that? I have law enforcement officers in my family that have served our community and worked with some really great people, and so just recognizing that it's not always a clear black and white response.
Team of Women United began in about 1989. Will you share its significance to the northern Pueblos?
I think it started a little before 1989. That's kind of like the reference we give. It really started as a peer support group for women that were meeting, and then they began to recognize that they had shared experiences, and they also wanted to change things. They also talked about not having a space in our communities for women's voices at that time to do it. And I think their courage and their bravery and their vision was beautiful. They recognized that in order to address some of the issues that they needed to be outside of tribal government, and chose to maintain kind of that independence, and so we're a standalone nonprofit. It took a lot of courage to be able to come forward and talk about child sexual abuse, to talk about sexual violence, to talk about domestic violence, to talk about suicides, substance abuse. One of our first grants was from Dr. Beverly Singer, helping with substance abuse and recovery. And so the women in that circle were struggling with some of that. They were struggling with relatives that committed suicide, their own personal experiences of violence directed at them. And it was always about healing. It was always about sisterhood, coming together for community, knowing that our community also harms us, but also recognizing, again, that historical trauma that our communities experience, and wanting to have some accountability. Because as women, we experience this, we also know our men experience, and our boys experience the same thing. So always trying to hold that, right? To hold that space for women, because we do need a space for us to gather, to share story, to strengthen our voice, then to be able to then extend the circle, or do the concentric circles, right? Where you have men's circles and young people circles and other people of color circles, but that you're still whole in yourself, and you still have your integrity as a Native Tewa woman, as a Native woman from the communities. So they were united by language, which was Tewa, and then also recognizing that we were relatives to others in our community. And so it became an intertribal organization, a multicultural organization, because we also recognize that our community members come from multiple races and multiple cultures, and being able to talk to that, but always gender-based. but we talk of the inclusivity of all in our community. So as we're saying, we're working to strengthen women, it doesn't mean that we're ignoring the men in our community. It's being able to create dialogue and have those different pieces, but what we can speak to is our experience as women.
You, Pueblo Women United seems to be an umbrella organization for many other programs. Can you describe some of these programs that, core programs that you have?
Yeah, so my understanding from historical conversations, in the early years of the formation of the organization, they held a gathering for all Tewa women. So 150 or 100 and some gathered at the college in northern New Mexico. And they're really trying to listen to women and what their experience was. And so looking at themes that kind of developed from that. So part of the themes that came up was the violence directed at women was environmental issues because of our Mother Earth and really knowing that our life is dependent on her life. And then other programming evolving from those experiences. And so one of our foundational program areas or focus is our environmental health and environmental justice program, because our communities are located downwind from Los Alamos. Our communities are those tribal communities that land was taken in order to create this sacred city. Secret city, right? Our most sacred lands as Tewa peoples, and also our relatives from Jemez and others downwind. And so wanting to have accountability, wanting to understand what was being done, because our community members were a workforce for Los Alamos, housemaids. So some of our members had relatives. And our people were dying of cancer, and we were curious and trying to understand why was that happening. And as we understood and began to look at what Los Alamos was doing, what research was being conducted and what experiments were being conducted, we here in New Mexico hold the whole cycle for the nuclear industry. From mining on tribal lands to research and creation to dropping and testing bombs on our own people here in New Mexico, to the burial, right, at WIP. And so really understanding that cycle and what that means to us and how they chose the site for its beauty, but also for its remoteness. So we went to Beijing in 1995. Was also part of that time frame, and we were there going as Native women, and because of our environmental interests, we're environmental, we want to also learn about what other women and communities were experiencing. And there was no Indigenous women's track. We were in the environment track or resource track. So that kind of was like, wow, and then from there spurred a lot of movement around Indigenous people's rights and Indigenous women's rights and platforms, and a lot of evolved. But really being there to understand, the UN process and our environmental piece. So we came back from there really ignited about, our gathering for Mother Earth and making people aware of the environmental degradations that were happening across the globe. It wasn't just our community, it was other communities. And how can we add our voice and add our prayers and our consciousness to that. And so that's our environmental justice piece. Our Voices program developed in 1994-95 because the women in our circle share story, and a majority of them had experiences of sexual violence. At that time, there was a lot of domestic violence programs that already existed. So DV, domestic violence, is not necessarily a primary focus of Tewa Women United. We look at it as it relates to sexual violence. But our Voices program, which is valuing our integrity, courage, empowerment, and support, is about supporting survivors of sexual violence and developing a culturally based response to sexual violence in Indian country. So we worked with the Santa Fe Family Center, the Santa Fe Rape Crisis Center, IHS, and Indian Health Services and Tail Women United to develop our Voices program, which integrates healing modalities. So our healing modalities are any ancient practice from yoga, breath work, cranial sacral, herbal, essence, flower essence, different kinetic, somatic processes, because those also release trauma in different ways. Our communities had ways of dealing with trauma and loss. And our experience of sexual violence is about trauma and loss. Loss of our innocence, loss of, what we thought the world was and what it was supposed to mean. And so being able to integrate the healing modalities with Western science or medicine, which is the talk therapy, we offered a combination of both. People could also access healers from their own communities if they chose to. We've done advocacy, we pay for counseling, we do training. We had our forensic program that got retired in 2013 as funding became more difficult and the push for standardization was occurring. But we still maintain our advocacy services and paying for and accessing counseling and therapy and doing community education awareness and trainings. And then so doing work in sexual violence for 20 some years, we were really looking at how do we prevent this from actually happening, right? We can do intervention and intervention. We can advocate for systemic change, but it doesn't mean that system changes. What the system was changing to was more around prosecution and putting people away without any actual intervention for the behaviors, and that they would come back to our communities and what do we do? So we talked more about prevention, and so as we talked about prevention, we talked about, well, how do parents become parents? We know the boarding school history in that historical trauma piece. We wanted to know what parents were being taught about, all types of trauma and violence, their experiences with substance use and all of that. So from there, we developed our Indigenous Women's Health and Reproductive Justice Program and our doula program. So if there was this disruption in parenting in our communities, how could we bring back and reclaim some of those processes and practices around birth and birthing and rearing of our children? And so for us, that was through our doula program. As survivors of sexual violence, breastfeeding, body trauma, different things happen. So how do we look at survivors giving birth? And so we've trained 24 community-based doulas. We are now launching this weekend our Doula Training Institute to train future doulas. Because of the work we've been doing for the past 10 years in our doula work, looking at different trainings and certification programs and really seeing that they weren't addressing the issues in our community, coming from a trauma-informed focus, understanding how survivors give birth, understanding cultural pieces from our communities and practices. Not that we're sharing that, but sharing philosophy, right? Because we feel like communities are the holders of that, and we can introduce and share certain herbal remedies, but not necessarily the sacredness around how communities handle naming or birthing or so we're doing a braiding. What we call petty is we braid Western knowledge and Indigenous knowledge to come up with a Tewa Women United approach to the different areas of our focus. And then so we developed our doula program, our reproductive justice program, as we look at survivors of sexual violence, access to abortion, for incest survivors and others, really advocating for women's voices in their decision making, that it should be a woman's choice to decide what choices she has. So we support the full spectrum from abortion to choosing to raise kids and as many kids as you want in the ways that you want. And so our doula our reproductive justice program has been a lot around that, and our prevention pieces are continuing. So we have our economic freedom program area and leadership development. So that houses our Sayaing, our grandmother's circle, our youth leadership development through our Aping youth councils. We are doing comprehensive sex education in our schools based on our connection and belonging as community members. There have been reports around teen birthing and different research that stigmatizes young people and young parents, that stigmatizes single parents, and understanding again the historical context of trauma and where we're at today and how that has impacted this whole area of honoring our sexual identities, honoring our sexual health and practices as women, as men, as community members. Really getting, for us, we call it the Aking Healthy Sexuality Body Sovereignty Project, because those things are important. Sexual health is important to our community's continued presence into the future. That we are coming at it from a open communication, not consensual relationship, that we are asking that all along the way, that we're teaching or helping to reteach our young people those core values of Sigimave'i, which is loving, caring, responsibility to yourself and others. Wawatsi, living your life as a prayer, and how do we continue to do those, and Aking is the respect for self and others. So coming at it again from our cultural base, our cultural knowledge, our cultural strength, to really help, we feel, transform the violence that is occurring, and that investment in our young people, that investment in our parents, that investment in ourselves to be able to do the healing, the relearning, and then simultaneously the transformation of the future for our young people and for our communities.
Mm-hmm. We talked about all your worldwide travels and the kind of consistencies that you saw among women's groups. Can you talk about that a little bit? And what you sort of came away from after all of these meetings?
Yeah. To be, like I said, to be blessed to be in circle and conversation with women from across the world has been powerful and has been a responsibility for me to be like, how are we continuing those relationships? And if we can't do it physically, how can we continue the sharing of that knowledge for our communities and for our community members and for our women? So we've been able to have connections to Russia through our anti-nuclear work, and be in circle with community who had similar experiences to us with Los Alamos and sacred cities and contamination of their land, and are facing sterilization rates. So for me, what I brought back from that experience was the reality, should there be another accident, because we haven't heard of, we are not privileged to a lot of information around exposures and what's been buried and what's been dumped, and understanding radionuclear half-lives, that they can exist for thousands of years, and going to Russia and seeing really beautiful landscapes. But you would take a Geiger counter out there and it would be off the charts. So you couldn't farm that land, you couldn't drink that water, you couldn't, but if you didn't know what happened there, that you would build your house, you would farm, you would do all of that. Meeting young people who were the same age as me, who were sterile because of their exposures and their parents' exposures to certain contaminations. And as an Indigenous person, witnessing that and coming here and realizing that we have our pueblos, we have our reservations, we're confined to certain spaces. Should that land and water and air become contaminated, that is a direct threat to our future existence as Pueblo people. As our people are dying of cancers that are not necessarily things that we were born with, but that may come through environmental pathways. For us to really understand that and advocate for stronger codes. So when Verna and Isleta Pueblo set their standards, that was like, wow, we can do that. And being in those circles with women who were advocating, who were trying to have their voices heard in different areas, and who faced immediate death. In China, when we went to the World Conference, that was what I brought back, was that women saved for years to get to this conference. It was a privilege for me to be able to go as part of Tewa Women United and a contingency of other women of color, and somebody paid for that. But to be there and to hear their stories of genocide, knowing that we experienced genocide, but that they were right in this moment experiencing genocide, that they were right in this moment losing land, was like, wow, like, what am I doing then, right? Like, so I have this personal experience of child sexual abuse, but I am not threatened with death every day. I have community, I have people that love me, I have this support. So what does that mean to then witness and hear other people's story and come back and just not do anything? So I think that really lit a fire for me, and I think for a lot of the women, to continue, right? To continue our work, to continue that we were on the path that was dealing with all of these things, and that we should continue on this path. And prayers, and a lot of prayers, and a lot of being in ceremony with Indigenous peoples from across the country, across the world, to really understand the importance of us continuing that our languages are our direct connection to who we are as a people. And so to be able to do what we can as Tewa Women United in language, and including language in our programming in the ways that we can, knowing that there's not necessarily an agreement within our communities around how it should be taught or how it should be spoken, but that we cannot wait for that moment either, that our children need that now, right? They're asking for that now. And so what little we can do, we are doing, knowing that it may not be the way somebody else would choose to do it, but that we're going with our hearts and our spirits and our prayers in that process. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, those circles and the ability to meet and talk. I think the one thing I also take from it is that we're not alone. Growing up in our community, sometimes I felt alone, like nobody else experienced this but me. Then you get into circle and you realize other people have had this experience and it's not just you. And then you get to bigger circles and you're there and you're like, wow, other people across this world are having similar experiences, and are also trying to change and transform systems to be responsive and to be accountable, and are looking at healing. Mm-hmm. So I think those were like the traveling, the sharing of information.
When I read that quote from you, it really struck me that one of the first things you say is that you're coming together to challenge governments. What do you mean by that?
As Indigenous people, as tribal people who've been impacted by multiple colonial systems, governmental systems, that we have to do it on our very, for us as Indigenous women with our own tribal government, right? Then we have to do it with the state who's making some decisions that is challenging sovereignty on a lot of different levels, to a national level where federal policy is being made that impacts our communities, to an international level that impacts San Ildefonso, that impacts Santa Clara, that impacts. So we are confronting governments. We are trying to strengthen women's voices so that they can advocate for themselves, and that we can collectively advocate for those things that we feel will benefit our families and our community, and to challenge those things that are causing harm to our families and our communities. When I think about our ancestors and what they were trying to hold on to as waves of things were being taken, as waves of things that were being challenged, that they held their ground, that they believed in carrying forward for the collective of our communities, our peoples. And so I feel like the work that I want to do and the work that I'm involved in is about continuing that legacy, that spirit. And sometimes it comes down to challenging even our own partners about voice, about fluidity of power, about how decisions are made in our families and our communities. And I think, like, I come from a lineage of those types of political warriors that may have also sometimes been challenged in their view because of the impacts of historical and intergenerational trauma, to be able to come to a place for us as communities to heal those pieces, and to really, I feel like right now we need to really be in conversation and make deeper commitments to what we want to carry forward, because we're at a time, like just having lost my aunt, that generation, and we're at this time of like our commitment, like my generation, our commitment, what are we carrying forward for our future generations? And in that commitment, I think, is still the continuation of challenging governments, of challenging systems. How do we stand in our own sovereignty? How do we stand in our own power? To know that we have the ability to create the ways that we want to be. That's the power that we have as people, that we are able to stand in our power and create the wellness that we want. To a certain extent, when you're still within that system, like we're still in this belly of this U.S. system, you know. So I think that has been the challenge of our ancestors, for us to continue to think about how do we continue to hold and continue to create.
How do you define your role as a Pueblo woman?
That's a hard one. Like saying, like, it's my generation to think about those pieces, because I tell my nieces all the time, you want to be the boss, right? You want to be the person making the decisions, but that's also really hard to do. But I feel like mothers do that all the time, right? We're making decisions for our children. We're making decisions for our family. And I've always, as a Pueblo woman, pushed against certain confining perspectives of what a traditional Native woman should be. I feel like if my ancestors, if my parents, if my grandparents, my great-grandparents did their job well, I am who I am. And as a Pueblo woman, to really honor the spirit, the language, the energy of all of that, and also still challenge those things that harm others. How do we do that? As a traditional Pueblo woman, as I sit here in my American dress with my traditional jewelry, I feel like I'm a mix of both, and hopefully the best of both, and if not the best of both, that I'm still on my journey to healing and reconciling those things that I want to change and transform in my personal life. The relationships that I want to have a positive influence and impact on. As someone who is leading an organization, you know, how are we creating the relationships so that it's bigger than the individual, right? And our communities are like that. They're bigger than the individual. And we get conflicted on that piece around what I want and then what is in the best interest of all. And so I think for us to be able to ask for prayers, ask for guidance, to make the best decisions that we can at that moment, with the less harm that we can do, is a huge thing for our tribal leaders. It's a huge thing for us as individuals to hold. But I hope as a Pueblo woman that I am honoring all of the lessons that I've learned and am making a positive impact on the people, communities, other organizations that I can.
How do you, one of the threads that we've had is mentoring, and what the individual, how important mentoring is to the individual. Who do you consider your mentors?
I consider my mentors all the women that I've been able to be in circle with, to learn from. I may not remember all their names, but I remember words, or I remember stories, or I remember actions. And most definitely the women in Tewa Women United who have shared their experiences, who have shared their vision, who have helped me to walk in a way that is grounded not just in my head, but in my heart and in my spirit. I also think, you know, those that have challenged me have also been my mentors. The experience of trauma and violence has also been a mentor, because it's like you learn, hopefully learn from that you learn to take away the goodness, to be able to transform that pain. So for me, my mentors are also those individuals throughout history who have suffered great harm, but have chosen to give back in the most positive way. The do unto others as they do unto you has been a hard thing to unlearn, right? I don't want to continue to harm others the way I've been harmed. I don't want to continue to use violence in ways to hold other people down. So how do you learn to walk with peace and walk with love and walk with compassion and walk with kindness? I feel like that's still my journey, and I'm learning and I'm in process. Because sometimes I don't, sometimes I fail. But I feel like the people I look up to are those that have made that choice, because it is a choice to make. And it's one that we make every day. So also those that, like my mom, I feel like my mom is one of my biggest mentors, and my dad, around prayer and around who we are as Tewa people, who we are as Pohoge Owinge, who we are, and the recognition that you are this and you have this integrity, but you're able to allow others in, right? We are the center, but the center within Mother Earth, we are all the center. And we're all in each other's spheres. So it's like really about that piece.
What, in a general sense, what advice would you give to young people growing up today?
Wow. I sit with my nieces and my nephews and the young people that are in our program. To listen with your ears and in your heart. To have compassion for others in our life, and to reach for their dreams. Don't take no for an answer. Sometimes be discerning. You gotta discern that. That we all at some point experience loss and violence, and that we all have the choice to choose to do good or to choose to continue the violence or the hurt or the harm. And that we believe in them, that they are the biggest gift that we have. When I heard that as a young person, I was like, bullshit. But yeah, they are our biggest gift, and to honor themselves in that way, that they are the future bearers of our future people. And I'm grateful for the women that reminded me of that, right? That responsibility. And that we can always overcome the harm or the behaviors that we once did. Because I have not always walked a good path. I have caused harm to my brothers and my sisters and my mom and my dad and others as an angry young person who didn't know what to do with all her emotions. And I'm hoping that I am a better role model for my relatives and for the young people that come into our program.
And that's a strength that you need to develop, right? As an individual, you need to develop those kinds of strengths that help you move from, one pathway to another along the journey that you're taking. So I think that's really valuable advice. And we're at the end of our interview. Can you believe that? And I just have one more question for you. Is there anything that we haven't asked you that you would like to address?
No, I don't think so. I didn't even know what I was going to say in this interview.
Well, that's the good part of the interview. So
I was like, how is this going to go?
Well, thank you very much for participating, and I think your words are certainly words of wisdom, and the strength that you show in what you do and how you do it really is admirable. And that's what I wanted to, in this project. Contemporary women are doing so much, and yet there's very little recognition of what they do. So thank you very much for participating.
Thank you for asking and inviting me into this.